In the grand halls of European history, few families have shaped the fate of nations quite like the Hapsburgs. Their power stretched across centuries, stitched together not by swords alone but by veils, vows, and royal unions. Behind every emperor was often a queen whose marriage sealed peace, whose letters steered diplomacy, and whose children carried the future of empires. These women weren't just consorts, they were strategists, rulers, and cultural icons in their own right. Their influence helped define not only dynasties, but the very fabric of European politics. Welcome to Words of Time, your gateway to the past where history comes alive through stories of power, intrigue, and legacy. In this video, we'll explore Habsburg Queens, the power of marriage, a journey through the lives of the women who stood beside the most powerful men in Europe and often led from behind the throne. From arranged alliances to political maneuvering, from courtly elegance to revolutionary downfall, these queens reshaped history one marriage at a time. Let's begin. In the intricate world of early modern European politics, royal marriages were far more than personal unions, they were geopolitical tools of immense consequence. Among the great dynasties that mastered this art, none wielded the institution of marriage with more calculated precision than the House of Habsburg. For centuries, the Habsburgs expanded their empire not through unrelenting warfare alone, but by engineering a series of strategic marriages that absorbed kingdoms, forged alliances, and outmaneuvered rival powers. At the center of this vast dynastic web stood the Habsburg Queens women who, far from being mere decorative consorts, were often vital agents of power, diplomacy, and cultural continuity. Their stories reveal the complex role of queenship in a male-dominated world, where feminine influence was both restricted by gendered norms and yet essential to the survival and expansion of the dynasty. To understand the role of Habsburg queens is to understand a unique form of political power, one exercised largely within the domestic, religious, and ceremonial spheres, but with consequences that reverberated across the continent. These queens were not sovereign rulers in the conventional sense, at least not often. They were rarely permitted to sit on thrones in their own right. Yet many of them were regents, mediators, cultural patrons, and perhaps most importantly, mothers to future rulers. Their bodies were battlegrounds for succession crises, and their fertility often held the keys to the longevity of a dynasty. In many cases, they served as diplomatic bridges between rival powers, their marriages symbolizing temporary peace or mutual obligation. Through their correspondence, their participation in court rituals, their interventions in religious affairs, and their management of households and courts, Habsburg queens exercised a form of soft but consequential power that male-centered histories have often overlooked. The famous Habsburg marriage strategy is encapsulated in the Latin saying, meaning, "Let others wage war, you fortunate Austria marry." This guiding principle was not a mere motto, but a foundational strategy that shaped Europe for centuries. By marrying into the royal houses of Spain, Portugal, France, Hungary, Bohemia, and beyond, the Habsburgs transformed themselves from regional princes in Central Europe into emperors of a sprawling composite monarchy. But this strategy depended entirely on the women who embodied these alliances. Without queens to cement the unions and bear heirs, the Habsburg dream of a universal Christian empire would have remained unattainable. Each marriage brought not only land and titles, but also networks of loyalty, cultural exchange, and often political complexity that had to be carefully navigated. Across the centuries, certain Habsburg queens emerged as particularly emblematic of this interplay between dynastic strategy and female agency. Margaret of Austria, for instance, never became a reigning queen herself, but served as a powerful regent in the Netherlands and a masterful matchmaker for the next generation of Habsburg rulers. Her court was a diplomatic hub, her political acumen widely respected across Europe. Isabella of Portugal, the wife of Charles V, ruled as regent during his imperial campaigns and provided crucial stability to the Spanish Habsburg realms. Her role illustrates the growing significance of queenly regency as a practical necessity in a sprawling empire. Later, Maria Theresa, the only woman to rule the Habsburg dominions in her own right, defied expectations by consolidating imperial power, engaging in military conflict, and strategically marrying off her children, most famously Marie Antoinette, to secure Habsburg interests. These women were not passive participants in a male-dominated world, but skillful navigators of its constraints. Through the language of piety, maternity, and service to the dynasty, they carved out roles that allowed for subtle forms of influence. Their authority was often informal or indirect, mediated through their relationships with husbands, children, and courtiers. Yet, this did not make it less real. In fact, much of their power lay in its invisibility, rooted in persuasion rather than command, presence rather than proclamation. The Habsburg court culture, steeped in Catholic ritualism and rigid protocol, gave queens a platform from which to exert influence through ceremonial symbolism, patronage of religious orders, and sponsorship of the arts. A key element of Habsburg queenship was the expectation that women not only secure alliances but embody them. Queens were expected to act as mediators between their natal and marital families, a balancing act that often placed them in impossible positions during periods of war or diplomatic tension. Yet, some queens used these dual loyalties to their advantage. Zita of Bourbon-Parma, the last Habsburg empress, famously attempted to broker peace between Austria-Hungary and the Allied powers during World War I through her familial connections, an episode that highlights the persistence of dynastic marriage diplomacy even in the modern era. Her failure marked the end of the Habsburg monarchy, but not the end of the queen's symbolic importance. Modern historiography has increasingly recognized that traditional political narratives have underestimated the contributions of queens. Where older histories often reduced them to childbearers or decorative figures, contemporary scholarship emphasizes their agency in court culture, diplomacy, and succession politics. Feminist historians in particular have sought to recover the voices and perspectives of queens through letters, personal records, and patronage networks, revealing the extent to which they shaped policy, culture, and even ideology. The study of Habsburg queens challenges us to rethink conventional ideas of political power, broadening the definition to include the effective, the ceremonial, and the interpersonal as legitimate forms of influence. Indeed, Habsburg queenship was as much about endurance as it was about dominance. These women bore the burden of dynastic continuity, often giving birth to 10, 12, or even 16 children. Their health and comportment were matters of state interest. Their failures were public, and their private lives rarely their own. Yet in spite of these constraints, or perhaps because of them, they helped to build and preserve one of the most resilient dynasties in European history. The Habsburg Empire may have been shaped by emperors, but it was sustained by queens. In exploring the lives of these women, this study does not merely seek to recover forgotten figures from the margins of history. Instead, it seeks to reposition them at the very center of the imperial narrative. These queens were not simply vessels for male ambition, they were, in many cases, the architects of dynastic success. Whether through strategic childbearing, careful diplomacy, cultural patronage, or direct political action, Habsburg queens exerted a quiet but essential form of power. Their marriages were not the end of their influence, they were its beginning. The origins of the House of Habsburg lie not in imperial grandeur, but in modest beginnings. Emerging from the Swiss region in the 10th and 11th centuries, the Habsburgs were originally a family of minor nobility whose early power was derived from local control over land and castle holdings, most notably the fortress from which they took their name, Habsburg or Hawk's Castle. The family's slow rise to prominence was marked not by heroic military conquests, but by patient accumulation of territories, careful legal maneuvering, and above all, strategic marriages. By the late medieval period, the Habsburgs had transformed themselves from regional counts into one of Europe's most influential dynasties. Their story is one of transformation, of turning private inheritance into public empire, and of using marriage as the most potent tool of dynastic expansion. The Habsburg identity was deeply rooted in the idea of inheritance as empire building. From an early stage, the family pursued a policy of expanding their influence through acquiring lands not through war, but through advantageous succession. This meant marrying into dynasties that were geographically and politically desirable, and ensuring that every union came with territorial gains or claims to future inheritance. The dynastic motto, which means "let others wage war," "You fortunate Austria, marry," was more than a clever phrase. It encapsulated the family's long-term vision, to create an empire not by destroying rivals on the battlefield, but by absorbing their territories through matrimony. This approach enabled the Habsburgs to extend their influence across Europe without incurring the costs and risks of constant warfare, though they were not above waging war when diplomacy failed. One of the earliest and most pivotal moments in the Habsburg rise came with the election of Rudolf, won as King of the Romans in 1273. His victory over King Ottokar II of Bohemia in 1278 enabled the Hapsburgs to acquire the duchies of Austria, Styria, and Carinthia, which became the family's core holdings. From this point onward, Austria would remain the political heart of the Habsburg domain. Yet the family's ambitions were never confined to the German lands. By the 15th century, they had married into the powerful Burgundian dynasty, gaining control over the wealthy and strategically critical Low Countries. This was the result of the marriage between Maximilian I and Mary of Burgundy in 1477, a union that fundamentally altered the geopolitical map of Europe and confirmed the Habsburgs' ability to leap from regional power to continental force through marriage alone. Another pivotal union was that of Philip the Handsome, son of Maximilian and Mary, with Joanna of Castile, the daughter of Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile. This marriage in 1496 united the Habsburgs with Spain, then the wealthiest kingdom in Europe, and soon to become a global empire. Their son, Charles V, inherited an astonishing array of territories including Spain, the Netherlands, the Holy Roman Empire, Naples, and large parts of the Americas. Charles's inheritance was so vast that it was said the sun never set on his empire, a global dynasty born from just a few generations of strategic matchmaking. These political marriages were not merely convenient alliances. They were often the result of years of negotiation, complex legal arrangements, and careful considerations of dowries, titles, and inheritance laws. The stakes were high, and the women involved were often under extraordinary pressure to produce male heirs to secure their family's claim. Queens and princesses became living symbols of treaties, their wombs the battlegrounds of succession crises. The union of Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile, for example, would later have profound implications for the Habsburg dynasty through their daughter Joanna. Her alleged mental instability became a political issue, as the Habsburgs sought to control Spanish claims through her son, Charles V. In this and many other cases, the personal and the political were inseparable, and women found themselves at the heart of dynastic calculation. Marriage was not simply a domestic arrangement, it was a geopolitical act. It provided the glue that held together vast, disparate territories across Europe. But the success of this system also depended on the roles played by Habsburg queens, who were far from passive participants in these unions. As consorts, they were expected to fulfill multiple responsibilities: bear children, support their husband's rule, maintain courtly decorum, and often serve as informal diplomats. Queenship in the Habsburg tradition was not a singular role, but a layered and evolving position, deeply influenced by local customs, religious expectations, and family politics. Some queens acted as regents during their husbands' absences or in times of minority rule. The queen regent could wield real authority, especially in the case of the Habsburgs, whose empire spanned such great distances that the emperor was frequently away. Isabella of Portugal, wife of Charles V, governed Spain in his absence and managed affairs of state with notable efficiency. Her regency was not merely ceremonial; she engaged in policy, coordinated military expenditures, and even influenced foreign diplomacy. In doing so, she demonstrated that queens could rule in their own right when necessary, and that their political competence could shape the trajectory of the empire. Other Habsburg queens played vital roles in securing dynastic continuity through childbearing. Fertility was not just a personal matter, it was a matter of state. A queen who failed to produce male heirs could trigger succession disputes, endanger political alliances, and weaken the legitimacy of her husband's rule. But childbearing alone was not enough. The education and strategic marriages of children, particularly daughters, became essential tasks. Many Habsburg queens orchestrated their children's futures, arranging marriages that replicated the strategy that had elevated them to power in the first place. Maria Theresa, for example, had 16 children and used them to forge alliances across Europe, most famously marrying her daughter Marie Antoinette into the French Bourbon court in a last-ditch effort to reverse centuries of rivalry between Austria and France. The role of the queen consort was, however, not without its limitations. While some wielded informal influence, others were confined to ceremonial duties or sidelined by court factions. The balance between being a wife, mother, and political actor was delicate and fraught with risk. A queen who appeared too assertive could be accused of meddling in politics or threatening the king's authority. Yet those who remained too quiet risked irrelevance. Queens had to perform a constant balancing act, being visible enough to uphold royal dignity and dynastic cohesion, yet discreet enough not to overshadow their husbands or challenge the male-dominated structure of power. Religious expectations also shaped queenship in profound ways. The Hapsburgs were staunch defenders of Catholicism, and their queens were expected to embody piety, moral virtue, and religious patronage. Many Habsburg queens supported religious orders, commissioned churches, and promoted Catholic values at court. Their religiosity was not merely a personal expression of faith, it was a public assertion of the dynasty's divine legitimacy. In the context of the Reformation and Counter-Reformation, queens played essential roles in upholding the ideological coherence of the Catholic Habsburg monarchy. Over time, the ceremonial and symbolic aspects of queenship became increasingly important. Habsburg courts were steeped in ritual, and queens served as the focal point for displays of dynastic prestige and cultural sophistication. Their clothing, jewels, and public appearances were all part of a larger spectacle designed to affirm the stability and magnificence of the monarchy. These performances had real political stakes. In times of crisis, the presence of a composed, dignified queen could reassure subjects of continuity and order. The Habsburg strategy of marriage and inheritance reshaped the political landscape of Europe and made the dynasty synonymous with imperial longevity. Yet this success rested heavily on the shoulders of the queens who fulfilled the roles of wife, mother, regent, and cultural icon. The distinctions between queenship, regency, and consortship were not fixed, but fluid, dependent on circumstance, personality, and the needs of the empire. These women occupied a complicated space within the power structure, both central to the dynasty's survival and constrained by its patriarchal framework. Their contributions, though often rendered invisible by traditional historiography, were essential to the Habsburg project. Without their marriages, their regencies, their patronage, and their reproductive labor, the Habsburg Empire could not have become the vast, interconnected realm that it was. They were not simply wives of powerful men, they were architects of empire in their own right. And though they rarely ruled alone, their influence was woven into the very fabric of European political life for over 5 centuries. Margaret of Austria stands as one of the most compelling figures in early modern European history, a woman whose life was shaped by loss, diplomacy, and exceptional political acumen. Though she never ruled a kingdom in her own name, nor bore children of her own, Margaret became a central architect of the Habsburg dynasty's rise to continental dominance. Her life spanned a crucial period in European history, when the Habsburgs moved from being a powerful regional dynasty to one that commanded vast realms from Spain to the Low Countries and across the Holy Roman Empire. Much of this success was underpinned by Margaret's talent for negotiation, her unmatched grasp of dynastic politics, and her relentless efforts to build alliances through marriage. Margaret's early years were marked by a series of dramatic political shifts and personal disappointments. Born in 1480 to Maximilian, one of Habsburg, and Mary of Burgundy, Margaret was a child of one of the most strategic and impactful marriages in Habsburg history. Her mother's untimely death left her father as the guardian of a vast and wealthy territory, the Burgundian Netherlands. From an early age, Margaret was treated as a diplomatic asset. At just 3 years old, she was betrothed to the future Charles VIII of France and sent to the French court to be raised as his future queen. However, in a brutal demonstration of how expendable women could be in dynastic calculations, Charles VIII repudiated the engagement when a more advantageous marriage opportunity arose. He chose instead to marry Anne of Brittany, thereby incorporating Brittany into the French crown. Margaret, still only 10 years old, was returned to her father, publicly humiliated but politically wiser for the experience. Her next engagement was with the heir to the Spanish kingdoms, the future John, Prince of Asturias. This marriage was far more emotionally satisfying for Margaret. She grew fond of John, and their union in 1497 appeared to strengthen Habsburg ties to the rising power of Spain. Yet tragedy struck again when John died only 6 months after their wedding. Margaret, then pregnant, miscarried shortly thereafter. Her grief was profound, and her status as a twice-widowed young woman without a living child seemed to spell the end of her political utility. Nevertheless, Margaret's value in the dynastic marketplace persisted, and she was married a final time to Philibert II, Duke of Savoy. This marriage, though also cut short by Philibert's death, was a happier match emotionally and marked a turning point in Margaret's life. After his passing, she chose not to remarry, dedicating herself instead to the service of her family's growing empire. It was in her role as regent of the Netherlands that Margaret's political genius truly emerged. Appointed by her father Maximilian and later confirmed by her nephew Charles V, Margaret governed the complex and fractious territories of the Burgundian Netherlands with remarkable skill for over 2 decades. Her court at Michelin became not only a center of political administration, but also a hub of diplomatic exchange and cultural refinement. As regent, Margaret oversaw finances, managed military defense, and navigated the difficult relationships between the local estates and the Hapsburg crown. Her governance was marked by pragmatism and intelligence, as she sought to preserve the loyalty of the cities while maintaining imperial control. Margaret's political strategy in the Netherlands relied heavily on personal diplomacy. She was an adept negotiator, trusted by her nephew Charles, who came to rely on her advice in dealing with foreign courts. She negotiated treaties, hosted ambassadors, and often acted as the de facto foreign minister for the Habsburg territories in the Low Countries. Her role was particularly significant during Charles V's minority, when she ensured the smooth transition of power and upheld Habsburg interests against both internal rebellion and external threats. Her correspondence reveals a woman of sharp intellect, careful calculation, and considerable political influence attributes that made her one of the most respected female rulers of her time. But Margaret's most enduring legacy lies in her role as the orchestrator of dynastic marriages that secured the Habsburgs' dominance in Europe. Though childless herself, she became a maternal figure to her many nieces and nephews, overseeing their upbringing and shaping their futures. Among them were future rulers like Charles V and Ferdinand I, as well as influential princesses whose marriages cemented political alliances across Europe. Margaret carefully plotted each match to maximize the dynasty's strategic position, using her personal experiences both triumphant and tragic to guide her approach. She arranged the marriage of Charles V to Isabella of Portugal, a union that would bring stability to the Spanish-Habsburg axis and produce the next generation of rulers, including Philip II of Spain. She also helped negotiate the marriage of her niece Eleanor to Francis I of France, part of a temporary peace between the two great rivals. These alliances, carefully timed and politically weighted, were not merely familial matters, they were acts of empire. Through these marriages, Margaret positioned the Hapsburgs as the nexus of European power, binding them into nearly every major royal house of the 16th century. Her ability to move among the volatile politics of Renaissance Europe earned her the informal title of the Grandmother of Europe, a moniker that spoke to her unmatched influence in shaping the continent's ruling families. What made Margaret so effective in this role was not just her political intelligence, but her capacity to understand the emotional and personal dynamics of dynastic politics. Having experienced the humiliations and grief of failed marriages, she approached matchmaking with sensitivity as well as strategy. She trained her young charges not only in court etiquette and diplomacy, but in the demands of royal duty, preparing them for lives in which personal desires would always be subordinate to dynastic needs. Margaret's regency was also notable for her patronage of the arts and humanist learning. Her court attracted poets, painters, and scholars, and she collected books, manuscripts, and artworks with both personal passion and political purpose. The image of the Habsburg dynasty that she cultivated was one of cultured refinement, devout Catholicism, and imperial legitimacy. Through art and ceremony, she reinforced the authority of the dynasty she served so faithfully. Despite her centrality to the Habsburg project, Margaret's contributions were long overlooked by traditional historians who focused primarily on kings and emperors. Yet recent scholarship has begun to re-evaluate her importance, emphasizing the structural power she wielded in a patriarchal system and the scope of her influence on the trajectory of European history. She governed vast territories, shaped the lives and futures of multiple monarchs, and executed a vision of dynastic power that was both enduring and transformative. Her life exemplifies the paradox of female power in the early modern period. Constrained by gendered expectations, yet capable of redefining the political landscape through intelligence, resilience, and strategic acumen. Margaret of Austria did not rule empires, but she built them. Her life, lived largely behind the scenes of formal power, reveals the machinery of dynasty and the quiet force of queenship as political strategy. In a world that treated women as pawns in the chessboard of international relations, Margaret became the player, a master of marriage politics, a skilled administrator, and a foundational figure in the Habsburg ascent. Her legacy is not written in conquest or bloodshed. but in the marriages that connected crowns, the policies that preserved empire, and the court she crafted as a bastion of order and sophistication amid the turbulence of the early modern age. Isabella of Portugal was one of the most powerful and politically significant queens of the 16th century. Her marriage to Charles V, Holy Roman Emperor and King of Spain, represented far more than a dynastic alliance. It was the convergence of two of Europe's most powerful royal houses, the Hapsburgs and the Avish of Portugal. Through this union, Isabella not only reinforced the geopolitical axis between Spain and the Habsburg Empire, but also brought with her wealth, diplomatic leverage, and administrative acumen. Over the course of her life, Isabella transitioned from consort to regent, from cultural patron to dynastic mother, and from an instrument of imperial strategy to one of its most effective agents. Her story reveals how a queen consort could become a central figure in governance and empire building in an era dominated by male rulers. The marriage between Isabella and Charles was the result of careful diplomatic consideration and mutual political interest. Charles, as ruler of a sprawling empire that stretched from Spain and the Low Countries to Austria and the Americas, needed a consort who would strengthen his position in the Iberian Peninsula and bring stability to his Spanish domains. The Portuguese princess was an ideal match. Not only was she descended from both Spanish and Portuguese royalty, thereby reinforcing Charles's claims in the Iberian world, but she also came from a lineage known for strong queenship. Isabella's mother, Maria of Aragon, was the daughter of the Catholic monarchs Ferdinand and Isabella, who had unified Spain and launched the country into its golden age of exploration and expansion. For Portugal, the marriage was also advantageous. It tied Lisbon to the vast Habsburg domains, giving Portugal influence over European affairs while ensuring that its maritime interests were protected under a broader Catholic imperial framework. The dowry Isabella brought with her was considerable, further bolstering the financial base of Charles's empire. But more than money or diplomacy, what Isabella offered was a sharp political mind and a strong sense of duty to her role as empress. Although Charles and Isabella's marriage was arranged, it evolved into one marked by mutual respect and affection. The couple married in 1526, and Charles quickly recognized Isabella's talents. Unlike many royal consorts who were relegated to ceremonial or domestic roles, Isabella was entrusted with real political responsibility. This was not a mere gesture of respect. Charles was often absent from Spain for long periods due to the demands of empire. He spent significant time in Central Europe, defending the Holy Roman Empire against both Protestant challenge and Ottoman aggression. During these absences, Isabella acted as regent of Spain, wielding authority over domestic administration, financial policy, and even foreign diplomacy. Isabella's regency was characterized by order, competence, and pragmatism. She held regular audiences with ministers, oversaw the Council of Castile, and signed royal decrees. Her ability to govern in Charles's name was widely recognized by contemporaries, including foreign ambassadors who noted her intelligence and decisiveness. Her regency was not a placeholder, but a legitimate period of rule in which she shaped policy and maintained stability. The respect she commanded among the Spanish nobility helped solidify Habsburg control at a time when loyalty to the emperor could not be taken for granted. She also dealt with issues of taxation, military recruitment, and the administration of justice, demonstrating a grasp of both day-to-day governance and long-term strategic concerns. Isabella's position as regent was further complicated by the cultural tensions within Spain itself. The unification of the Iberian kingdoms was still relatively recent, and the memory of local autonomy and the Reconquista remained strong. The Castilian nobility could be fractious, and maintaining their loyalty required deft negotiation and political balance. Isabella, through her tact and understanding of Castilian court culture, managed to navigate these challenges effectively. She maintained close ties with the Spanish grandees, while also working with royal officials to ensure the crown's prerogatives were upheld. In addition to her political work, Isabella played a central role in shaping the cultural and religious life of the Spanish court. As a devout Catholic and supporter of the Counter-Reformation, she endorsed religious orthodoxy and was a patron of the Church. She supported various religious orders, including the Dominicans and Franciscans, and encouraged the spread of Catholic doctrine throughout Spain and the empire. Her piety was not performative, it was deeply woven into her identity as queen and empress. She maintained a disciplined court that emphasized moral behavior, religious devotion, and ceremonial propriety. In doing so, she helped model the kind of Catholic monarchy that the Hapsburgs sought to represent across Europe. The cultural patronage of Isabella also extended to the arts and intellectual life. Under her guidance, the Spanish court became a center for literature, music, and architecture. She patronized Spanish and Portuguese artists, encouraged the production of devotional works, and played a part in establishing the ceremonial grandeur that would become characteristic of the Habsburg monarchy. While her husband's court in Central Europe had a more cosmopolitan tone, Isabella's regency helped cement a distinctly Iberian style of Habsburg rule that emphasized solemnity, Catholic piety, and centralized authority. Isabella's influence was perhaps most profound in her role as mother and educator of the next generation of Habsburg rulers. She gave birth to 7 children, though only 3 survived into adulthood. Among them was Philip II, who would go on to become King of Spain and one of the most powerful monarchs of the early modern period. Isabella took an active role in Philip's education, ensuring that he was well-versed in the languages, religious obligations, and political customs of the empire he would one day inherit. Her insistence on a disciplined, Catholic upbringing shaped Philip's worldview and helped produce the rigid, formal ruler who would later clash with Protestant England and manage a sprawling global empire from Madrid. Isabella also understood the importance of dynastic marriages in preserving and expanding Habsburg power. Though she did not arrange as many marriages as Margaret of Austria, she participated in discussions regarding alliances and helped prepare her children for their roles in the European political theater. She instilled in them the values of loyalty to the church, devotion to duty, and the burden of royal responsibility. Her early death in 1539, at just 36 years of age, marked a profound loss for the empire. Charles was devastated by her passing and never remarried. In fact, he kept her memory alive in both personal and political ways. He commissioned artworks in her honor and carried her portrait with him on his travels. In the famous funerary chapel at El Escorial, built by their son Philip II, Charles ensured that their tombs would lie side by side, a testament to their shared rule and enduring partnership. Even after her death, Isabella's influence lingered in the structure of Habsburg power. The model she established for queenship, combining religious devotion, administrative competence, and dynastic loyalty, was emulated by future generations. Her regency became a precedent for other female rulers and regents in the Habsburg world, demonstrating that a queen consort could be a central figure in imperial governance without challenging the authority of the emperor. Her careful stewardship of Spain during Charles's absences allowed the emperor to focus on external threats, confident that his domestic rule was in capable hands. Isabella's life also reveals the often overlooked realities of queenship in early modern Europe. While kings and emperors might dominate the public record, the success of their rule often depended on the women who supported, advised, and represented them. Isabella was not merely a consort. She was an empress in the fullest sense, an administrator, cultural arbiter, dynastic strategist, and deeply committed partner in the Habsburg imperial project. Her capacity to balance these roles with dignity and effectiveness helped shape the image of Spanish monarchy for generations. She operated within the limitations of her time, but she expanded the possibilities of female political power through her example. Isabella of Portugal transformed the role of queen from a ceremonial support to a pillar of governance. Her intelligence, devotion, and political foresight earned her not only the respect of her contemporaries, but also a lasting place in the history of the Habsburg dynasty. Her life was a bridge between Iberian monarchies and continental empire, between personal tragedy and public duty, and between traditional femininity and real political authority. In her, the Habsburgs found not just a wife for their emperor, but a ruler whose vision and discipline helped shape the empire at its most expansive and ambitious moment. Maria and Anna of Austria, daughters of Emperor Charles V's brother Ferdinand I, represent a compelling case of parallel queenship in the Habsburg dynasty. Born into a family that saw marriage as a tool of imperial expansion and consolidation, both sisters were thrust into politically strategic unions that extended Habsburg power eastward and westward. Maria in Central Europe, Anna in the Iberian Peninsula. Their lives were shaped by dynastic needs, personal resilience, and the pressures of succession, but they also embodied a quieter form of influence through correspondence, motherhood, regency, and court diplomacy. Though geographically distant, their roles were intertwined, their loyalty to the dynasty unwavering, and their contributions central to the Hapsburg strategy of trans-European. Maria of Austria was married to King Louis II of Hungary and Bohemia, a union that symbolized Hapsburg hopes to consolidate influence in the fragile and contested region of Central Europe. At the time of their marriage in 1522, Hungary stood as a vulnerable bulwark against the expanding Ottoman Empire. Louis II was young, inexperienced, and his realm politically fractured. Maria, though equally young, came from a lineage of women trained in diplomacy, regency, and religious piety. Her marriage was intended to secure an alliance between the Jagiellonian and Hapsburg houses and to reinforce Catholic resistance to Ottoman incursion. However, the marriage was cut tragically short. In 1526, just 4 years after their wedding, Louis was killed at the Battle of Mohacs, a catastrophic defeat that led to the collapse of Hungarian independence and opened the door to Ottoman occupation of large swathes of the kingdom. Maria, now widowed at 20, became a pivotal figure in the ensuing dynastic crisis. Though she had no surviving children with Louis, her status as his consort gave the Hapsburgs a legal and symbolic claim to the Hungarian and Bohemian crowns. Her brother Ferdinand, already Archduke of Austria, moved swiftly to assert these claims, eventually being elected King of Bohemia and, in the contested Hungarian succession, ruling over the Habsburg-controlled portion of Hungary. Maria supported her brother's political ambitions, advocating for Habsburg legitimacy and helping manage relationships with local nobles who were wary of foreign rule. For the rest of her life, she remained a significant presence in Central European court life, particularly in the courts of Vienna and Prague, where her wisdom and experience were drawn upon by younger generations. Despite her personal loss and lack of heirs, Maria chose not to remarry, instead dedicating herself to political service and dynastic solidarity. She became a vital participant in Habsburg court diplomacy, especially in managing correspondence among various branches of the family. Her ability to maintain relationships with both Austrian and Spanish relatives made her a valuable intermediary. Known for her intellect and seriousness, she earned the respect of male relatives, including her nephew Philip II of Spain and her brother Emperor Ferdinand. She maintained a court that upheld Habsburg traditions of piety and formality, often acting as an unofficial advisor and fostering a network of loyalty among noble families in the region. While Maria's life was shaped by war, loss, and political survival in the East, her younger sister Anna of Austria embarked on a different but equally strategic marital path. In 1549, Anna married her first cousin, Philip II of Spain. This union was designed to reinforce the dynastic unity between the Austrian and Spanish branches of the Habsburgs. Given the enormous expanse of the empire and its dependencies, such internal consolidation was crucial. Philip, whose first 3 marriages had failed to produce a viable male heir, was in need of a fertile and politically loyal consort. Anna fulfilled both requirements. Their marriage produced 5 children, including the long-awaited male heir, the future Philip III of Spain. Anna's contribution to the Spanish court lay not only in her reproductive success, but also in her capacity to represent the Habsburg ideal of female virtue and dynastic loyalty. She adapted quickly to Spanish court culture, which was increasingly marked by solemnity, religious orthodoxy, and a highly ceremonial structure. Her upbringing in the imperial Habsburg household had prepared her for this role. She was devout, obedient, and conscious of her symbolic importance as the empress and mother of the next generation. Her bearing helped reinforce the ideological continuity of Habsburg rule across the Austrian-Spanish divide. Anna also became an important figure in courtly rituals and religious patronage, supporting Jesuit institutions and promoting Counter-Reformation values. Her relationship with Philip II was marked by mutual affection and respect, an unusual characteristic in a dynasty that often viewed marriage as an impersonal strategy. Philip valued Anna not just for her childbearing ability, but for her composure, her counsel, and her stabilizing influence on the court. Her presence helped soften Philip's reputation for coldness and aloofness. Moreover, in a court where factional rivalry and intrigue were constant threats, Anna served as a unifying figure, carefully managing her household and fostering alliances with key nobles and clergy. Despite her influence, Anna's role was largely confined to the private and ceremonial aspects of queenship. Her authority did not extend to formal regency, and unlike her sister Maria, she did not govern in her husband's absence. However, through her position as mother of the heir and queen consort of Spain, she wielded immense soft power. Her death in 1580, shortly after the birth of her last child, was mourned deeply by Philip, who never remarried. Her legacy lived on through her son Philip III, whose character and piety bore the mark of her careful influence. What binds Maria and Anna's stories together is not merely their shared bloodline or queenship, but the strong bond they maintained throughout their lives, despite living in different parts of the empire. Their letters, many of which survive, offer a rare glimpse into the emotional and political worlds of early modern queenship. These letters were not mere exchanges of familial sentiment. They often contained detailed accounts of court life, health matters, child-rearing practices, and dynastic concerns. They functioned as tools of diplomacy, reinforcing the cohesion of the Habsburg family across great distances. Through their correspondence, the sisters coordinated responses to events, shared intelligence about court factions, and offered mutual support during moments of crisis. Their political sisterhood was reinforced by shared values: loyalty to the Habsburg name, commitment to Catholic orthodoxy, and a belief in monarchy as divinely sanctioned. They both worked to protect the interests of their natal and marital families, often serving as go-betweens in conflicts or misunderstandings among male relatives. Their letters reveal the emotional labor and intellectual engagement that underpinned the seemingly ceremonial roles they occupied. They wrote with insight about military campaigns, succession anxieties, and the complex webs of marriage negotiations that defined Habsburg diplomacy. Both Maria and Anna also cultivated court networks of women noble ladies-in-waiting, governesses, and confessor advisors through whom they exercised influence. These women formed a critical part of the dynastic infrastructure, relaying information, managing households, and serving as conduits between court and countryside. In their courts, Maria and Anna modeled the virtues expected of queens: chastity, piety, humility, while simultaneously using their positions to shape policy and perception. Their patronage of religious orders, chapels, and educational institutions served not only personal devotion, but also political messaging, reinforcing the idea that the Habsburgs were the defenders of Catholic Christendom. In the broader context of Habsburg queenship, Maria and Anna exemplify how women could serve as anchors of dynastic stability. They occupied different realms, but their roles were complementary. Maria, through her widowhood and courtly leadership, ensured that the Austrian Habsburgs maintained their grip on contested Central European territories. Anna, through fertility and domestic governance, secured the future of Spanish Habsburg rule. Together, they embodied the twin imperatives of queenship: to nurture and to represent. Their influence may not have been enshrined in legislation or commemorated in military victories, but it was foundational in the continuance of Habsburg authority during a century of religious war, imperial rivalry, and dynastic transition. The significance of Maria and Anna lies not only in their personal achievements, but in what their lives reveal about the operation of power within royal families. They show how queenship could be simultaneously constraining and empowering, limiting informal authority, but rich in informal influence. They remind us that dynastic strategy was not solely the domain of kings and emperors, but also of sisters, mothers, and consorts, whose quiet labor sustained the empire from within. Through their lives, we gain a deeper understanding of how the Habsburg dynasty remained resilient across generations and geographies. Its web of alliances held together not just by treaties and battles, but by letters, marriages, and sisterly resolve. Maria Theresa of Austria stands as one of the most remarkable monarchs in European history, a queen whose life was shaped by dynastic necessity, political crisis, maternal duty, and enlightened reform. She inherited the throne through an unprecedented legal instrument, faced immediate and existential conflict, found in marriage not only a partner but a political ally, and went on to forge a powerful, internally coherent empire. Her reign blended the strict piety of Catholic absolutism with the administrative rationalism of the Enlightenment, transforming the Habsburg monarchy into a modern state. When her father, Charles VI, promulgated the Pragmatic Sanction of 1713, he sought to ensure that his hereditary lands, the Austrian Netherlands, the kingdoms of Bohemia and Hungary, the estates of Milan and Parma, would remain intact under his daughter in the absence of a male heir. This was a bold break with traditional male succession, and from the start, it signaled that Maria Theresa's rule would rest on both legal innovation and political maneuvering. As the daughter and designated heir, she was the living embodiment of the sanction, but acceptance by European powers was far from assured. When Charles VI died in 1740, Maria Theresa ascended amidst skepticism and outright hostility. Frederick II of Prussia seized on the opportunity, invading Silesia and igniting the War of Austrian Succession. Within weeks, Britain, France, Bavaria, Saxony, and Spain, as well as savvy Wettin and Wittelsbach pretenders, joined the fray, each seeking to carve out or reclaim Habsburg lands. Maria Theresa, untested and a mother of 2 young children, embraced the challenge, refusing to relinquish a single piece of dominion she considered rightfully hers. Her personal letters from that time reveal a stillness under pressure, afraid, yet resolutely determined. One of the most striking aspects of Maria Theresa's life was her marriage to Francis of Lorraine, a union that balanced affection, alliance, and strategic calculation. Though he lacked the dynastic prestige of Bourbons or Hapsburgs, Francis was an experienced military leader and landholder in Lorraine. The pairing, arranged as was all Habsburg marriages, not only brought 16 years of age proximity and emotional compatibility, but also secured a partner who could mature alongside her rather than eclipse her. Their marriage blossomed into a real partnership. Francis supported her reign, acting as co-regent and later Holy Roman Emperor. Their union symbolized both dynastic continuity and personal compatibility, a luxury in the high-stakes world of royal marriage negotiations. It was as a mother to 16 children, 10 of whom survived infancy, that Maria Theresa demonstrated her unrivaled capacity for maternal diplomacy. Her coffers of dynastic currency, the marriages of her children, were critical to securing alliances that buttressed her reign. Her daughters were married into a dazzling array of royal houses: Marie Antoinette to France, Maria Carolina to Naples and Sicily, and Maria Amalia to Parma. Her sons secured Hanoverian fealty and Austrian influence in Naples. In each case, she negotiated dowries, pressed for dynastic leverage, and shaped the political map of Europe. Through her brood, she produced a network of related monarchs who could be counted upon in various diplomatic emergencies, a living web of Habsburg ascendancy. But Maria Theresa's vision extended far beyond marital alliances and dynastic geography. She inherited a sprawling, inefficient, even archaic bureaucracy, riven by privilege and regionalism. In response, she embarked on a long series of administrative reforms that modernized the Habsburg state. She centralized taxation to ensure reliable revenues, reorganized the army to meet the strategic challenges posed by Prussia and the Ottoman Empire, and instituted standard legal codes in her domains. While firmly committed to Catholicism, she also promoted structured civil administration and opened up opportunity in government to competent nobles, though not the commoners, to strengthen the crown's power. Her reforms further reached education. She sought to expand schools and public instruction, though always within a religious framework. Yet her reign was not without internal friction. Religious conservatism resisted her more modernizing impulses, while landed estates bristled at centralized taxation. Nevertheless, she navigated these tensions with a mix of firmness and flexibility that displayed her political skills. She could browbeat recalcitrant nobles with the threat of military imposition, or placate them with court honors and local privileges. The result was a state that was stronger, more coherent, and better able to compete with European rivals. Historians often identify her governance as a distinctive form of enlightened absolutism, blending centralized authority with carefully managed reforms aimed at improving state capacity while maintaining monarchical legitimacy. Maria Theresa's personal piety felt in her public treatment of judges, her involvement in the sacraments, and her attendance at Mass informed the ceremonial and diplomatic texture of her government. Her court dress, protocol, and religious devotion reflected her commitment to the Catholic monarchy. Yet she simultaneously tried to restrain ecclesiastical autonomy in particular areas of taxation, appointment, and education, negotiating a kind of state supremacy over the church that prefigured Josephinum. Perhaps one of the most consequential outcomes of her reign was the consolidation of Habsburg resilience. She retained most of her hereditary possessions despite the Silesian War, losing Silesia temporarily, but winning sympathy and support through skillful diplomacy and marriage diplomacy. By the time she died in 1780, she had not only preserved but reformed the monarchy into a more intelligible, modern state equipped for the coming age of revolutions. In her later years, Maria Theresa became a symbol of a deeply religious, militarily tested, administratively competent empress who embodied the continuity of Habsburg power. She may not have proclaimed herself as an enlightened despot, but she unmistakably presided over profound institutional reform. The stability of the monarchy during her long reign helped set the stage for her son Joseph II's more radical reforms and define the nature of Habsburg rule well into the 19th century. Maria Theresa's life and reign reveal the complex reality of queenship and female sovereignty in the 18th century. She was not a mere consort, nor was she a ceremonial figurehead. She was a monarch in her own right whose political instincts, familial networks, and administrative reforms reshaped Central Europe. Through strategic marriage, military resistance, bureaucratic centralization, and principled devotion, she forged a stronger, more modern state out of a fractious imperial inheritance. The story of Maria Theresa is not simply one of dynastic reproduction, it is a story of female leadership at the highest level in one of Europe's most powerful states, navigating war, peace, change, and continuity with an authority that endured beyond her own lifetime. Marie Antoinette's life story is one of intense spectacle, political intrigue, and dramatic downfall, embodying the transformative forces of 18th-century Europe. Born into the powerful Habsburg dynasty, she was sent to France at age 14 to seal a long-standing alliance between the Hapsburgs and Bourbons. This marriage was not merely dynastic but also strategic. France, wary of Habsburg dominance, sought to neutralize its powerful neighbor by forging this one of dynastic history's most celebrated and ultimately tragic marriages. For the Hapsburgs, it secured a Bourbon ally at the very heart of European politics. Thus, Marie Antoinette became a political instrument from adolescence, branded a living piece of diplomatic real estate. She arrived in France with all the weight of expectation upon her shoulders, idealized as the daughter of Maria Theresa and a symbol of international unity. But within the gilded halls of Versailles, she encountered a court culture antithetical to her upbringing. The labyrinthine etiquette, elaborate fashion, and rigid gender roles defined a queen's existence. She was expected to embody French grandeur, charm aristocrats, and smoothly produce heirs, while avoiding scandal and even the slightest sign of overreach. Yet the young archduchess struggled to adapt. Linguistically and culturally distant, she was mocked as the Austrian woman, and rumors about her behavior colonized court gossip. Critics later claimed she was frivolous, wasteful, and too fond of gambling and extravagant hunting excursions. Pamphleteers, early masters of propaganda, leveled harsh attacks, painting her as an alien influence on French morals. Still, her popularity seemed resilient for a time. She cultivated a separate social universe at the Petit Trianon, gathering close friends and artists, distancing herself from court formalities. The intimacy of these gatherings offered respite, but they also invited fresh criticism from those who believed she was isolating the monarchy. The queen's maternal anxiety compounded her public strain. Rumors persisted that she was sterile or incapable of fulfilling her dynastic duty. In fact, she had 4 children, but the early years without an heir intensified court speculation and damaged the monarchy's credibility. Soon, however, the drumbeat of political crisis overshadowed her personal life. Economic collapse, war debt, and Enlightenment demands for reform colluded with her public persona to make her a lightning rod. Radical voices portrayed her as Madame Deficit, a vampiric spender during national famine. Yet most of these complaints betrayed deeper institutional failure. She was easier scapegoat than Louis XVI, harder to attack directly. As revolutionary fervor built, she became a symbol of royal excess. The diamond necklace conspiracy, a scandal involving a fake purchase scheme, was never proven against her, but irreversibly damaged her image, amplifying public belief in her immorality. As political tensions escalated, she shifted from social luxuries to political engagement. Rather than passive victim, she intervened on behalf of the king, urging resistance to parliamentary pressure, encouraging counter-revolutionary plots, and advising on military matters. She even asked her brother, Emperor Leopold II, to aid France. These moves transformed her from a costume prince into an active participant in the political struggle, but also sealed her fate in the eyes of revolutionaries. To them, she was not a foreign pauper, but a traitorous conspirator. With the outbreak of revolution in 1789, she found herself trapped in Versailles, then in the Tuileries Palace. The attempted escape at Varennes shocked France and confirmed fears that the monarchs could not be trusted. Her letters and secret communications with émigrés and Austrian allies were intercepted and published, fueling suspicion. Arrest in 1792 and the monarchy's formal abolition followed swiftly. Once imprisoned, she endured months of terror in the Temple prison, separated from her children and shunted between despair and defiance. Her trial in late 1793 was brief and perfunctory. The charges of treason, sexual immorality, and plotting with foreign powers were expected. She was the perfect victim for revolutionary justice. On October 16, 1793, she was executed by guillotine. Her head removed, her body buried in an unmarked grave, she was politically erased. Yet from the ashes of tragedy, her image transformed. European monarchies mourned, tapping into her death to frame their own legitimacy in spiritual and dynastic terms. Royalist émigrés romanticized her as a martyr and maternal saint, while émigrés beyond France lamented the destruction of divinely sanctioned monarchy. Over time, historians would revisit Marie Antoinette's life with more nuance. They recognized that many of the slanders against her were shaped by misogyny and xenophobia as a woman with power in a hostile country during revolutionary times. Modern scholarship has highlighted her patronage of the arts, her complex emotional life, and her political agency. The Petit Trianon, once dismissed as frivolous, has come to stand as a space of female autonomy and identity invention. Her careful nurturing of her children, especially the monarchist aspirations she instilled in her son and daughters, signals dynastic continuity in defiance of political upheaval. In the 20th and 21st centuries, Marie Antoinette has inspired filmmakers, novelists, and public debates about femininity, monarchy, and revolution. Her life raises enduring questions. When does a queen's personal expression become political disruption? How does one balance duty with authenticity under constant surveillance? And what is the role of gendered narrative in historical memory? In the final reckoning, Marie Antoinette shattered not simply an era of monarchy, but the illusion that queenship could remain untouched and untested in a world that demanded democratic legitimacy. Her death crowned the rise of a new political order, one defined not by birthright, but by the will of the people. Empress Elizabeth of Austria, better known as Sisi, embodied a paradox. She was both the beloved romantic figure of Europe and a fraught consort battling the expectations of imperial life. Her marriage to Emperor Franz Joseph, one reflected fairy tale beginnings, but soon gave way to disillusionment and rebellion against the constraints of court life. Over decades, she redefined the role of the empress by withdrawing from ceremonial politics, championing Hungarian autonomy, and crafting a public image that has echoed across time. Her assassination in 1898 drew worldwide attention and helped enshrine her memory as a tragic, almost saintly symbol caught between the gilded cage of monarchy and the modern impulse for emotional authenticity. Elizabeth's marriage to Franz Joseph in 1854 was arranged as much for dynastic calculation as for romantic allure. The young archduchess from Bavaria was plucked from obscurity to marry Austria's young emperor, who himself sought escape from political tension. At first glance, their union appeared idyllic, a teenage belle and a handsome emperor, drawn together by family ties and youthful passion. Yet beneath the veneer of affection lay expectations typical of Habsburg rule. Elizabeth was to be the mother of heirs, the symbol of imperial dignity, and a partner in ceremonial court life. As she entered Vienna's tightly controlled court, she encountered a web of rules and protocol that demanded conformity rules she would resist throughout her life. Within months, Elizabeth bore a daughter, Sophie, and then a son, Crown Prince Rudolph. Despite fulfilling her role as mother, she found motherhood isolated and demanding. Her relationship with Franz Joseph, though affectionate, was tinged by distance. Each held separate worldviews shaped by upbringing and temperament. Elizabeth remained restless, often traveling, seeking solitude in Hungary, Italy, and the Alps. She chafed under the weight of Vienna's rigid expectations. Public appearances, formal audiences, court gossip. The dazzling palace life, more than it nourished her, felt suffocating. Her resistance to court life revealed itself through her obsessive attention to beauty and personal health. Some historians view her anorexia and dieting as symptoms of deeper emotional withdrawal, an attempt to exert control in a life otherwise dictated by external expectations. Elizabeth's routines, her fitness regimens, her razor-thin waist, her nightly bathing illustrate how bodily discipline became a means of political self-definition. In her rejection of the court's indulgent norms, she crafted a personal rebellion against the life she was meant to live. By the 1860s, Elizabeth was increasingly haunted by a sense of estrangement. She refused to sit for formal portraits or participate in gala events. Instead, she invested her energies in pursuits that offered freedom: equestrianism, poetry, and extensive travels. She wrote her own verses, many reflecting sorrows and longing a rebellion in private even when command was denied in public. Amid this personal turmoil, a political opportunity beckoned. Elizabeth had long been drawn to Hungary. Preoccupied with nationalist sentiment and seeking stability after dual revolution-era upheaval, Hungary needed a symbol to affirm its place within the empire. Elizabeth became that symbol. She learned Hungarian, immersed herself in its court culture, and prodded Franz Joseph to reconcile with the Hungarian nobility. Her private diplomacy found public expression in the 1867 Austro-Hungarian Compromise, which created the dual monarchy and granted Hungary its own parliament and equal status alongside Austria. While the compromise reflected wider geopolitical pressures, Elizabeth's role in nudging imperial favor toward Hungarian autonomy indicates her influence and her use of personal identity to enact political change. Following the compromise, Elizabeth became a living emblem of the dual monarchy. Hungarian politicians celebrated her as the reconciler, enhancing her popularity and lending legitimacy to the new political system. She traveled to Budapest, received Hungarian nobles at court, and appeared in public wearing traditional Magyar dress. Her embrace of Hungary helped redefine her consort's role, an imperial figure who could transcend the restrictions of the Viennese court and shape the political narrative of the empire. Yet the liberation Elizabeth found in Hungary also deepened the tensions with the Viennese aristocracy. She was increasingly at odds with Empress Sophia, her domineering mother-in-law, and courtiers suspicious of her independence. Her frequent absences, her theatrical yet aloof public image, and her insistence on privacy-fueled rumors and criticism. In Vienna, she was alternately praised for her elegance and derided as eccentric or distant. The court struggle between tradition and modernity played out in her life, as she carved a niche that spanned performance, politics, and personal mystique. Her later years were marked by tragedy. The suicide of Crown Prince Rudolf in 1889 at Mayerling devastated Elizabeth, deepened her retreat into loneliness, and intensified her rejection of bureaucratic life. She spent much of her time traveling, governed by clairvoyance, and attending to causes like prison reform and mental health rare interests for a queen of her time. Her life became an odyssey shaped by grief, social withdrawal, and purpose. In 1898, she was assassinated in Geneva by an Italian anarchist while strolling by Lake Geneva. The assassination stunned Europe, prompting worldwide mourning. Crowds in Budapest, Vienna, and Munich wept openly. Her coffin passed through the grand avenues of Vienna to her final resting place in the imperial crypt. In death, Elizabeth acquired a mythic status. Framed by court life as a tragic heroine, she became an icon of purity, pain, and unfulfilled desire. Her image was sanctified. Streets, films, and novels celebrated her as an independent spirit crushed by monarchy. Over the 20th century, historians began reconsidering Elizabeth's legacy, not as a fragile beauty, but as a political actor shaping public sentiment within the empire, defying court norms and impacting state structure. Feminist scholarship highlights her resistance to gendered expectations, reframing her anorexia and austerity as forms of political agency rather than pathology. Cultural critics view her self-fashioning her hairstyle, dress, travel as an early form of celebrity, projecting autonomy in a world that narrowly defined female power. Elizabeth's enduring legacy lies in her capacity to embody contradictory impulses: royal duty and individual freedom, public expectation, and personal rebellion. She was not a conventional political actor, but her life left real effects. She helped fashion Austria-Hungary, humanized monarchy in the eyes of the public, and provided a model of emotional authenticity that resonated across eras. In death, she became a cult figure whose symbolic power outlived the empire itself. Empress Elizabeth stands between two ages. Born into autocracy, shaped by court tradition, yet yearning for modern identity. Her life and death haunt our understanding of monarchical constraint and personal autonomy. She shattered the mold of consortship not by overthrowing the system, but by living in defiance even within it. Her story reminds us that queenship could be a site of both oppression and quiet revolution, and that personal rebellion within power can sometimes redraw the boundaries of political possibility. Zita of Bourbon-Parma, the last Empress of Austria and Queen of Hungary, was born into a world already teetering on the edge of collapse. By the time she married Archduke Charles of Austria in 1911, The Habsburg Empire was a complex patchwork of nationalities, political tensions, and centuries-old dynastic entanglements. Yet her marriage, at once a symbol of dynastic unity and a personal partnership, represented more than just a union of royal houses. It fused two ancient Catholic lineages at a moment when monarchies across Europe were struggling to remain relevant. Zita, a Bourbon princess from the exiled Parma line, brought with her the weight of legitimacy and tradition, but also an acute awareness of political fragility. Her union with Charles I came to symbolize a last, urgent attempt at dynastic continuity in an empire already fraying under the strains of nationalism and modern war. Zita's upbringing in the Bourbon-Parma family had already instilled in her a deeply Catholic worldview, a strong sense of dynastic duty, and a cosmopolitan outlook shaped by life in Italy, Austria, and France. She was fluent in multiple languages and educated with an emphasis on governance and faith qualities not always expected of royal daughters. These traits made her an ideal match for Charles, the heir presumptive to Emperor Franz Joseph. Their marriage, based on genuine mutual respect and affection, was rare for dynastic unions of the time. Zita quickly assumed not only the traditional roles of a consort, but also an increasingly political presence, especially as Europe slid into the chaos of the First World War. With the death of Franz Joseph in 1916, Charles ascended the throne and Zita became empress at the height of the war. From the start, she was no mere figurehead. She sat in on military briefings, reviewed diplomatic cables, and engaged in strategic conversations with Charles. In a court where women were often relegated to ceremonial functions, Zita's political engagement marked her as a formidable consort. She believed the monarchy had a moral obligation to seek peace, and that the continuation of war would only hasten the end of their rule. Her influence would become most evident in one of the most ambitious and secretive attempts at peace during the war, the Sixtus Affair. The Sixtus Affair, named after Zita's brother Prince Sixtus of Bourbon-Parma, involved a clandestine effort by Charles and Zita to broker peace with the Allied powers behind the backs of their German allies. In 1917, Zita, leveraging her family connections, persuaded her brothers Sixtus and Xavier, both officers in the Belgian army, to carry peace proposals to France and Britain. The goal was to negotiate a separate peace that would extract Austria-Hungary from the war and preserve the monarchy. Charles wrote personal letters acknowledging the rights of Belgium and expressing willingness to discuss Alsace-Lorraine, France's primary concern. These gestures, facilitated by Zita, were extraordinary. However, the effort unraveled when French Prime Minister Georges Clemenceau publicly revealed the correspondence. The Germans, infuriated by Austria's back-channel diplomacy, tightened their grip on the alliance. The revelation embarrassed Charles, and by association Zita, whose family role in the affair fueled suspicion in Vienna and Berlin. Still, the episode showed how actively and creatively Zita engaged with high diplomacy, navigating the channels of power with the urgency of a ruler fighting for the survival of her world. When the war ended in 1918, the Austro-Hungarian Empire collapsed into a sea of republican movements and national secession. Charles refused to abdicate, declaring instead that he would withdraw from state affairs. Zita famously supported his stance, insisting that a monarch could never voluntarily renounce a crown divinely entrusted to him. Her famous quote, "A sovereign can never abdicate. He can only be deposed," reflected not only her dynastic commitment, but also her belief in monarchy as a sacred institution. This stubborn refusal to recognize the empire's dissolution cost the couple dearly. They were forced into exile, first to Switzerland, then Madeira, where Charles died in 1922 after falling ill. Zita, just 30 at the time, was left a widow with 8 children and no throne. In exile, Zita did not retreat into obscurity. On the contrary, she became the standard-bearer of Habsburg legitimacy. For decades, she moved between Europe and North America, maintaining correspondence with monarchist circles, advising her children, especially Otto von Habsburg, the eldest son and heir, and engaging in quiet political advocacy. She emphasized the Christian and moral aspects of monarchy, framing the Habsburgs as defenders of peace, unity, and tradition in a modern world corrupted by totalitarianism and secularism. Her public appearances, though discreet, often drew large crowds of monarchist sympathizers. She supported anti-communist and Catholic causes, aligning herself with a post-war vision of Europe grounded in Christian democracy. Despite her political convictions, Zita remained a deeply private woman, devoted to her children, her faith, and the memory of Charles. She never remarried. Her life in exile was modest, often financially strained, and dependent on supporters. Yet her determination never faltered. Even after the Second World War, she continued to advocate for a Europe guided by moral leadership and monarchist principles, viewing the Habsburg legacy not as a relic, but as a possible antidote to the excesses of modern nationalism and ideological extremism. Zita's piety was a cornerstone of her identity. She attended Mass daily, observed religious fasts, and raised her children with the same intense Catholic devotion she had inherited from her own family. Over time, this personal sanctity became a central aspect of how her legacy was remembered. In the final decades of her life, especially after the Second Vatican Council, Catholic traditionalists and monarchist groups began to view Zita not merely as a political figure, but as a model of Christian womanhood. After her death in 1989, these circles began advocating for her beatification, a formal recognition of her holiness by the Catholic Church. The beatification process, which began in 2009, focused not only on her personal virtues, patience, faith, resilience, but also on her role as a mother, widow, and monarch who bore suffering with grace. The movement reframed her exile and loss as a spiritual trial, casting her life story in terms that resonated with Catholic martyrdom and sacrifice. For many Austrians and Hungarians, Zita came to symbolize not only the loss of empire, but also a nostalgia for a time when rulers claimed to serve higher values than politics alone. Her memory was cultivated through biographies, religious commemorations, and pilgrimages to her burial place in Vienna's Capuchin crypt, where generations of Hapsburgs are entombed. Zita's legacy today is multifaceted. She is remembered as the last empress of a vanished world, as a political agent who tried to steer her empire toward peace, and as a woman who bore the weight of history with quiet determination. Unlike many royal consorts, Zita's story did not end with her husband's death or the fall of her realm. She reimagined the role of empress in exile not as a passive widow, but as a custodian of memory, tradition, and dynastic identity. She became a bridge between old Europe and the post-imperial world, reminding later generations of a time when queens and empresses could wield power not through force, but through faith, endurance, and unwavering commitment to a vision greater than themselves. In the broader arc of Habsburg queenship, Zita stands as both an ending and a continuation. With her, the centuries-long tradition of Habsburg female influence met its modern end, but not in silence or irrelevance. Her efforts to maintain dynastic dignity, to influence public discourse, and to transmit her values across generations ensured that the Habsburg name remained part of Europe's cultural consciousness. In life and in death, she preserved the symbolic authority of monarchy, even when its political reality had vanished. Her story is not only about the decline of an empire, but about how personal conviction and historical imagination can keep dynastic identity alive long after the crown has fallen. Throughout Habsburg history, daughters of the imperial house were not merely born into privilege, they were born into purpose. As archduchesses, their identities were inseparable from the family's broader diplomatic ambitions, and their lives were defined more by treaties than by personal choice. Marriage for a Habsburg daughter was never solely a private affair. It was a tool of statecraft, used to secure alliances, claim distant thrones, and diffuse political tensions across Europe's tangled web of dynasties. While the empresses and queens often received the greatest historical attention, countless archduchesses, some crowned, many not played essential roles in maintaining the geopolitical structure of the Habsburg dominion through their marriages, engagements, or even the symbolic weight of their refusals. The House of Habsburg treated marriage as a form of soft imperialism. For every Maria Theresa or Marie Antoinette, there were numerous lesser-known archduchesses whose unions served more obscure but still essential purposes, reinforcing dynastic ties with smaller German principalities, stabilizing Central European Catholic monarchies, or embedding Habsburg influence in distant courts. Archduchess Maria Anna of Austria, for example, was sent to Portugal to marry King John V, becoming queen consort of a realm far removed from Vienna's direct control, but still strategically significant. Others, like Maria Amalia, married into the Duchy of Parma, an arrangement designed to strengthen influence in northern Italy. Each marriage served a carefully calculated function, often negotiated by mothers, grandmothers, and court advisors who understood that each daughter was a potential outpost of Habsburg power. Yet these marriages did not always come to fruition. The diplomatic landscape of Europe was volatile, and many proposed alliances collapsed under the weight of shifting allegiances, military developments, or personal resistance. One of the most notorious broken betrothals involved Napoleon Bonaparte. In 1809, seeking to legitimize his new empire and produce an heir, Napoleon initially sought the hand of a Russian Grand Duchess. When that failed, he turned to the Austrian court and requested Archduchess Marie Louise, the daughter of Emperor Francis I. But she was not his first choice. Earlier overtures had been made for other Habsburg princesses, and their rejection reflected the family's hesitation about linking itself to a man who had recently defeated them in battle. Marie Louise ultimately agreed under intense political pressure to marry Napoleon, and although she became Empress of the French, her story was marked by ambivalence, exile, and estrangement from her Austrian roots. Her marriage illustrated not only the success of Habsburg marital diplomacy, but also the personal costs it often exacted. Other cases show how unrealized alliances shaped international relations as much as consummated ones. Archduchess Maria Christina, one of Maria Theresa's favorite daughters, was nearly married off to a foreign prince, but her deep affection for Prince Albert of Saxony led her mother to allow a love match, an extremely rare concession. In contrast, her sisters were given no such choice. Maria Carolina was married to Ferdinand of Naples, a marriage fraught with cultural distance and political instability. Some negotiations, like the proposed match between Archduchess Maria Leopoldina and a Northern European noble, never progressed beyond formal discussions. In such moments, the mere possibility of a marriage could sway diplomatic strategy or serve as a tool in larger negotiations. The emotional cost of these unions, or their absence, often surfaces in personal writings. The court diaries and letters of Habsburg archduchesses give us a rare glimpse into the interior lives of women whose public identities were so tightly controlled. In these texts, one finds longing, resistance, loneliness, and at times deep affection for husbands, siblings, or lost homes. Archduchess Maria Clementina, who was sent to Naples and later to the court of Sardinia, wrote candidly about the sense of alienation she felt, the burden of ceremonial life, and the longing for her family in Vienna. Letters between sisters frequently expressed frustration at being treated as diplomatic pawns, even as they offered support and shared in one another's constrained agency. These writings also reveal the extent to which these women saw themselves as participants in dynastic strategy, not just victims of it. Many accepted their fates with a sense of duty grounded in faith and tradition. They viewed their marriages as contributions to the stability and longevity of the Habsburg order, often believing that their sacrifices were necessary for the preservation of peace or Catholic unity. This mindset, though difficult to reconcile with modern ideals of autonomy, was embedded in the fabric of early modern dynastic culture. Even in cases where marriage did not occur, the symbolic capital of an archduchess could be powerful. The mere offer of a Habsburg princess in marriage conferred legitimacy upon a suitor or signaled the seriousness of imperial interest. In moments of crisis, war, succession disputes, or regional rebellion, these daughters could be strategically dangled as incentives for alliance or loyalty. Their names appeared in treaties, letters, and political gossip long before any engagement was finalized. Over time, the centrality of marriage to Habsburg policy waned as the structure of European politics evolved. The rise of nationalism, the decline of royal houses, and the spread of republicanism in the 19th and 20th centuries gradually diminished the strategic utility of such unions. Yet the memory of these marriages and of the women behind them remained embedded in the dynastic imagination. The court records, dowry arrangements, bridal journeys, and royal births are all part of the vast paper trail that reveals how integral these women were to the empire's very architecture. The story of Habsburg archduchesses thus expands our understanding of queenship and dynastic power. These women may not have ruled in their own right, but they carried the empire across borders in their persons. Through their wombs, treaties were secured. Through their presence in foreign courts, cultural diplomacy unfolded. Through their letters and diaries, the emotional weight of empire building becomes visible. Their influence, quiet, itinerant, often anonymous, was nonetheless foundational to the Habsburg strategy of domination through marriage. What endures in their stories is not merely the political calculation, but the human dimension. The tension between duty and desire, isolation and ambition, obedience and agency, define the lived experiences of these imperial daughters. They remind us that diplomacy has always had a personal cost, and that even in an age of kings and emperors, it was often the women sent abroad, watched closely, remembered fleetingly who carried the empire on their shoulders. The role of Habsburg queens extended far beyond dynastic marriage and childbearing. They were pivotal figures in shaping the cultural, spiritual, and ceremonial life of one of Europe's most enduring empires. Their power was often most visible not in politics or war, but in the subtler realms of faith, art, and ritual. As queens, consorts, and regents, these women were not only symbols of continuity, but active agents in preserving and promoting a Habsburg identity grounded in Catholic orthodoxy, imperial grandeur, and highly gendered ceremonial performance. Their participation in the religious and cultural landscape of the monarchy helped solidify the Habsburgs as not just rulers of land, but stewards of a worldview in which divine right, artistic excellence, and courtly formality were intertwined. Central to this influence was their role as defenders of the Catholic faith. The Habsburg dynasty, long associated with the militant defense of Catholicism, especially during the Reformation and Counter-Reformation, relied on its queens to embody and perform religious devotion with visible and emotional intensity. Whether through public acts of piety, sponsorship of ecclesiastical orders, or the maintenance of Marian cults, Habsburg queens functioned as spiritual exemplars for their subjects. In many cases, their education and religious formation were guided by Jesuit confessors, whose influence shaped not only their inner lives, but also their public policies and patronage. The Jesuits, themselves agents of Counter-Reformation zeal, found in queens willing allies in the cultural recatholicization of the Habsburg lands. Marian devotion, in particular, was a defining aspect of queenly religiosity. The Virgin Mary, seen as the ideal intercessor and model of feminine virtue, provided queens with a spiritual archetype that legitimized their roles as wives, mothers, and rulers. Many queens commissioned altars, paintings, and chapels dedicated to Mary, reinforcing the association between divine motherhood and dynastic continuity. Public processions, feast days, and the daily rhythm of court liturgy were steeped in Marian symbolism. In this way, queens used religion not only to project personal piety, but also to articulate their authority within a theological framework that celebrated obedience, compassion, and maternal power. Their cultural patronage was equally significant. Habsburg queens played a decisive role in shaping the artistic and aesthetic contours of the imperial courts. They commissioned architecture that reflected their piety, and prestige churches, convents, and royal chapels often bore their names or coats of arms. Music, too, was an arena of influence. Queens sponsored composers, court musicians, and liturgical choirs whose work enhanced the grandeur of court life and sacred ceremonies. Their personal tastes helped import and disseminate styles from other parts of Europe, especially Italy, France, and Spain, blending local traditions with broader continental trends. Fashion was another realm through which queens expressed cultural leadership. Their wardrobes were not merely personal choices, but political instruments. Lavish dress served to display the wealth and refinement of the court, to assert dominance in diplomatic encounters, and to set trends emulated across Europe's aristocracy. Gowns embroidered with religious symbols, color-coded for liturgical events, or layered for symbolic modesty, conveyed layered messages about gender, virtue, and hierarchy. Portraiture captured and amplified these messages, with official paintings showing queens in formal poses, often flanked by saints or set against imperial regalia, emphasizing both their humanity and their exalted status. The performative aspect of queenship reached its apex in court rituals and spectacles, where symbolic power was made visible and real through elaborate ceremony. From coronations to childbirth, from baptisms to funerals, the life of a Habsburg queen unfolded within a series of carefully orchestrated events that reinforced the divine and dynastic nature of monarchy. These rituals were saturated with gendered meaning. The queen's role in producing heirs, for example, was commemorated through ceremonial practices that affirmed her reproductive value and sanctified motherhood as a royal function. The court paid attention to how queens entered rooms, how they addressed nobles, how they moved during religious processions. Every gesture could be interpreted as either affirming or challenging the invisible architecture of power. Queens also navigated and helped enforce the strict hierarchies of court etiquette, which themselves were tools of control and expression. Who was permitted to address the queen, how close one could approach her, whether one was seated or standing in her presence. These rules, often codified in court manuals, served to define and maintain social order. The queen's body became the focal point for both reverence and surveillance. At once untouchable and scrutinized, she embodied the paradox of female authority in a patriarchal system, elevated yet constrained, central yet controlled. Nevertheless, within these constraints, many queens found room to maneuver. Some used their ceremonial roles to build networks of influence, rewarding loyal courtiers, intervening on behalf of artists or clergy, or securing positions for family members. Patronage became a form of soft power, and through the distribution of resources and favors, queens shaped both cultural production and political alliances. In some cases, their chapels or salons served as hubs for theological debate, musical innovation, or literary exchange, positioning them not only as consumers of culture, but as curators and creators of meaning. The symbolic power of queenship often outlasted their lifetimes. Tombs, funerary rites, and posthumous images preserved their legacies in forms that could be interpreted and reinterpreted by later generations. Some queens were remembered as saints, others as tragic figures or martyrs, their stories woven into the mythology of the dynasty. Even when they were unpopular in life, their image could be rehabilitated through religious or artistic memorialization. Their lives offered a template for female virtue and royal comportment, shaping the expectations placed upon their successors. In all these ways, Habsburg queens were more than ornamental presences at the center of empire. They were cultural agents, spiritual guides, and orchestrators of ritual life. Their actions and appearances resonated far beyond the confines of the palace, influencing how subjects understood sovereignty, femininity, and divine favor. Their power may have been coded in symbolic and aesthetic terms rather than legislative ones, but it was no less real. Through their faith, their patronage, and their performance of courtly roles, Habsburg queens left an indelible mark on the empire they helped to define. As the 20th century dawned, the Habsburg Empire, once the most formidable dynastic power in Europe, was already showing signs of decay. The forces of nationalism, liberal reform, industrialization, and mass politics had begun to erode the foundations of monarchical rule, and the old strategies that once held together a sprawling empire were proving ineffective in the face of modernity. For centuries, the Habsburgs had governed through a careful orchestration of religious unity, dynastic marriages, and bureaucratic control, with their queens often at the center of these mechanisms. But by the time the First World War erupted, those very tools had lost their efficacy. The empire's final years brought the dissolution not only of political power, but also of the royal ideals and gendered authority that had upheld it. The role of Habsburg queens in this twilight period remains essential to understanding the broader imperial decline and how memory, identity, and gender politics persisted even in exile. The First World War marked a point of no return. Franz Joseph I, who had ruled since the revolutionary waves of 1848, died in 1916 amid a war that had exposed the fragility of the empire's multi-ethnic structure. His grandnephew, Charles I, ascended the throne with his wife, Zita of Bourbon-Parma, as empress. Zita was not merely a ceremonial partner. She was deeply involved in wartime diplomacy and attempted peace negotiations, embodying a very traditional idea of a Catholic queen in a rapidly collapsing world. Her efforts to sustain the monarchy's legitimacy through dynastic continuity and religious conservatism stood in stark contrast to the revolutionary fervor overtaking much of Europe. But despite her intelligence and resolve, the Habsburg monarchy could not withstand the nationalist uprisings, military defeats, and internal disillusionment that came to a head in 1918. The collapse was swift. Charles abdicated in November of that year, refusing to formally renounce the throne but accepting the actual end of Habsburg rule. The imperial family was forced into exile, first in Switzerland, then in Madeira, where Charles died in 1922. Zita lived on for decades, raising her children in exile and working tirelessly to preserve the legacy of the monarchy. Her presence in European royal circles served as a living reminder of a bygone era. Even in displacement, she upheld the decorum, traditions, and religious values that had defined her position. Her continued insistence on the divine right of kings and her refusal to acknowledge the Republic in Austria reflected the enduring worldview that many Habsburg queens had inhabited. One where rule was sacred, lineage was destiny, and women, as guardians of dynastic continuity, bore unique historical responsibilities. Despite the fall of the monarchy, the Habsburg name did not vanish from European politics or society. Through strategic marriages, descendants of the dynasty continued to play roles in other royal houses. This phenomenon of dynastic echoes reveals the residual power of the Habsburg legacy, not as a political structure, but as a cultural and symbolic presence. In Belgium and Luxembourg, Habsburg blood still runs through the veins of modern monarchs. These connections, while largely ceremonial in a democratic age, continue to validate royal legitimacy in subtle ways, linking present-day monarchies to an illustrious and deeply historical past. The Grand Ducal family of Luxembourg traces part of its lineage to the Habsburgs, maintaining a connection that reinforces its Catholic identity and continuity with European aristocratic tradition. Similarly, Belgian royals with Habsburg ancestry underscore the dynastic interconnectedness that still binds European royal families in symbolic kinship. In these marriages, one sees the enduring prestige of the Habsburg name, long after its political empire had crumbled. These unions no longer serve the geopolitical function they once did, but they carry weight in terms of cultural capital and historical memory. The Habsburg queens, even in their most ceremonial or seemingly passive roles, left behind a model of feminine power that outlived the empire itself. Their actions illuminate how women shaped diplomacy, governed symbolic spaces, and exercised influence in a patriarchal world. They negotiated marriages, guided spiritual life, acted as regents, and raised future monarchs. In many cases, they did so without formal authority, yet their presence was central to the functioning of the imperial machine. As historians re-examine the role of women in shaping statecraft, queenship emerges not merely as an appendage to kingship, but as a parallel institution with its own rituals, obligations, and influence. Lessons from the lives of these women extend beyond historical curiosity. They challenge the traditional narrative of political history as solely male-driven and military-focused. The Habsburg queens offer a counterpoint, a vision of diplomacy rooted in kinship, culture, and communication. Their contributions remind us that power can be exercised through marriage contracts, religious patronage, and the management of courts just as effectively as through laws and armies. Their influence is also visible in how nations remember and commemorate their pasts. In post-imperial Austria, figures like Maria Theresa are still celebrated for administrative reforms and educational initiatives, while Marie Antoinette and Elizabeth Sisi have become global icons, often romanticized but nonetheless representative of deeper tensions between monarchy and modernity. This memory has been further shaped by popular culture, religious veneration, and evolving ideas about gender. Empress Elizabeth's transformation into a tragic heroine or fashion icon in films, literature, and museum exhibitions shows how the figure of the queen continues to fascinate and provoke reinterpretation. Zita's beatification process by the Catholic Church points to the continuing intersection of sanctity, monarchy, and femininity. These women are no longer political agents, but they remain symbols through which contemporary societies engage with questions of identity, tradition, and loss. The twilight of the Habsburg dynasty did not spell the end of its queens. While the thrones vanished, the ideas these women embodied persisted. They remain part of a longer, transnational story of how gender, faith, and family shaped Europe's past, and how they continue to resonate. The lessons they offer are not only about power, but about its limits, its rituals, and its human cost. Through their letters, portraits, tombs, and continued presence in cultural imagination, the queens of the Habsburg Empire remind us that history is not just about those who rule from above, but about those who move behind, besides, and within the visible mechanisms of empire. Throughout the long and complex history of the Habsburg dynasty, queens played a central, though often understated, role in shaping the political, cultural, and dynastic course of Europe. While much of traditional historical focus has centered on emperors, kings, and generals, the narrative of Habsburg power is incomplete without a close understanding of the women who stood beside the throne or in certain moments on it. Through marriage, diplomacy, governance, and motherhood, Habsburg queens influenced international relations, sustained dynastic legitimacy, and curated a legacy of imperial identity that transcended the rise and fall of kingdoms. Their contributions were not incidental but foundational, woven into the very strategies that allowed the Habsburgs to rule over a multi-ethnic, multilingual, and multi-confessional empire for centuries. Marriage, for the Habsburgs, was not merely a private or personal arrangement, but a calculated strategy of empire building. The now famous phrase, "let others wage war," You, fortunate Austria, Mary, reflected the family's conscious decision to expand influence and territory through marital alliances rather than through endless military conquest. Queens were the keystones in these arrangements. Their unions with foreign princes and kings established claims to thrones, secured peace treaties, and bound the far-flung parts of Europe into a Habsburg network. These marriages created a transnational matrix of loyalty and identity that gave the dynasty an extraordinary reach from the Iberian Peninsula to Central Europe, from Naples to the Netherlands, from Bohemia to Belgium. In many cases, queens were born into one court, married into another, and tasked with embodying the union of two dynasties, two realms, and often two competing national interests. Yet these women were not merely passive conduits of dynastic will. They acted within, and at times against the expectations placed upon them. Marriage became not only a tool of statecraft, but also a field of resistance and self-expression. Some queens resisted the strictures of court life or exerted influence behind the scenes through personal networks, correspondence, and patronage. Others transformed their roles by stepping into governance directly, acting as regents or de facto rulers when their husbands were absent or incapacitated. From Isabella of Portugal managing the empire in Charles V's absence, to Maria Theresa ruling in her own name and redefining the very possibility of female sovereignty, these queens made visible the capacity of royal women not just to support but to wield power. The maternal role of queens was also far more than biological. Producing heirs was central to the preservation of the dynasty, and the political significance of motherhood was immense. But raising future monarchs involved careful instruction in diplomacy, language, faith, and statecraft. Habsburg queens often ensured that their children embodied the values and loyalties that sustained imperial cohesion. Maria Theresa, who gave birth to 16 children, deployed them in a calculated diplomatic strategy that married daughters into nearly every major Catholic court in Europe. These offspring were both emotional bonds and political tools, stitched into the fabric of alliances and treaties. Through motherhood, queens shaped not only their immediate families, but the future political geography of Europe. Beyond the palace walls, queens were also agents of cultural continuity and, in some cases, transformation. They acted as patrons of the arts, sponsors of religious institutions, and curators of courtly aesthetics. Their tastes and preferences shaped the architecture, music, and fashion of the Habsburg realms. Religious devotion, often intensely expressed, was not only a personal virtue, but a form of political legitimacy. Queens commissioned chapels, endowed monasteries, and maintained court rituals that reflected and reinforced the Catholic identity of the dynasty. At the same time, some queens also became cultural symbols in ways that exceeded or contradicted their political roles. Elizabeth of Bavaria, better known as Sisi, became an icon of romantic melancholy and resistance to court protocol, while Marie Antoinette's style and extravagance, however misrepresented, fed into a revolutionary critique that transformed her into a scapegoat for an ancient regime in decline. The queens of the Habsburg Empire thus stood at a unique intersection of tradition and change. As bearers of continuity, they anchored the dynasty in sacred rituals, genealogical claims, and transgenerational strategies. But they were also capable of becoming vehicles for transformation, reinterpreting femininity, exerting independent political will, or challenging the expectations of their roles through subtle or overt acts of agency. Their lives reflected the broader tensions of European monarchy, between faith and secularism, between absolutism and reform, between empire and nation. Even after the collapse of the empire in the early 20th century, the legacy of these queens endured. Zita of Bourbon-Parma, the last empress, preserved the habits and values of a bygone imperial order well into the modern age, her exile marked by both stoicism and continued political ambition. The memory of earlier queens lives on through religious veneration, national mythology, academic reassessment, and popular culture. They remain subjects of fascination, not because they were mere consorts to powerful men, but because they navigated and often shaped the very architecture of that power. In reflecting on their historical significance, it becomes clear that Habsburg queens were not anomalies or exceptions. They were part of a broader European phenomenon in which royal women served as nodes of power, communication, and cultural transmission. The Hapsburgs, perhaps more than any other dynasty, perfected this model and depended upon it. Through them, the institution of queenship was both stabilized and stretched to new dimensions. They embodied the contradictions of monarchy in a changing world, both ceremonial and substantive, both subordinated and influential. Their stories urge a rethinking of how history is told and remembered. To overlook these women is to misunderstand the very mechanisms of early modern and modern power. They were not simply behind the throne, but part of the throne itself, its image, its continuity, its legitimacy, and sometimes its salvation. In marriage, in governance, in motherhood, and in cultural stewardship, the queens of the Habsburg dynasty helped make Europe. And in their reflections, at times adorned in brocade and pearl, at times exiled and grieving, we find the enduring presence of women who shaped the contours of empires not only through their bloodlines, but through their minds, hearts, and will.